Hello, everybody. So today we're going to be walking through the CRISP-DC consent tool. So the first step into going into the CRISP-DC consent tool to be able to register consent for your patient or someone who is at your organization, you first need to log into the CRISP-DC portal. You can also access the CRISP-DC consent tool through your EHR application, through your in-context application. So if you have an EHR that you're able to launch CRISP from, you should be able to also navigate to the consent tool from that application. But today we'll be showing through the CRISP-DC portal. So I'm first going to log in with my email and my password. And then it's going to ask me to do my two-factor authentication. So I'm just going to quickly do that and approve of that. All right. Once I am in the CRISP-DC portal, I see our patient search functionality. And so in order to be able to register a consent for a patient, you do need to enter in the first name, last name, and date of birth of the patient before you're able to register consent and open the consent tool. So I'm going to be searching for our test patient, Gilbert, today. So I'm going to be putting in his first name, last name, and date of birth. And then once I search for Gilbert, I find the account that I want. So we're going to go into this first one here, as that is our test patient. And so once you click on the patient's name, you should get a drop-down menu of different applications. You can also see that there's your dashboard here, which also has all the same tools listed. So from here, I'm just going to click into the consent tool. And then I'm also able to find the consent tool on this left-hand column of these different reports and applications. But for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm just going to collapse this for now because we want to focus on the consent tool. So once we're in the consent tool, there are three different forms available. So the first form is the Part 2 provider form. So this is the form that is going to release that patient's SUD data protected by 42 CFR Part 2 through the HIE. We also have a prevention of harm form. This form is something that is required for us to have and allows providers to block patients from seeing certain data on themselves if there ever were to be a patient-facing platform of the HIE. But since we currently do not have that functionality, we do not utilize this form. And then third, there's a patient opt-out form, and this is a link that actually just takes you to the CRISP-DC opt-out form, where if a patient wishes to, they can choose to completely opt out of sharing any data with the HIE. So this form is available there as well. It can also be found on the CRISP-DC website. So I'm going to click into the Part 2 provider form. And so once we're in this form, the first thing that we see is a banner of consent status. And so this is just letting us know that this patient has opted to disclose all SUD treatment data, and it expires, this consent expires on the 31st of January. So this is a really good indicator for when you're registering a Part 2 consent for your patient, just to say, hey, does this patient already have a consent on file? And if they do, and the consent isn't expiring soon, or it's set to does not expire, then another consent is not needed for the patient. However, in this case where, the patient their data is going to stop being shared on the 31st, so just in a couple weeks here, we're going to want to, maybe have a conversation with the patient and say, hey, do you want to register another consent? Once it gets close to that time, maybe set a reminder or have the patient come back in before or around that date so that you can have them reconsent to sharing their data if they wish to continue having their data shared through the HIE, that is. So that's just a good indicator of the next steps that are needed with the patient. If nothing comes up, that probably means that the patient doesn't have an active consent on file, and so one should be registered. And I'll also go through the consent history tab, so then you can kind of see a history of the consents that the patient previously has had on file. I'm just going to dismiss this. So first we have the patient details, so just any of that basic demographic information on the patient. We also have information about this consent. So this is just legal language. There's also links here where you can request a list of organizations that have received your information by requesting an accounting of disclosures. We also have a link to our frequently asked questions and our website, which has educational resources available for your reference and for patients' reference as well. And then we have some more information just saying, that you can request that list of disclosures again. And then we get into the type and the amount of disclosures. So we see here that there is the different consent options. So there's currently, so with the updated 42 CFR Part 2 rule, there's only one option to disclose all of that SUD data for treatment, payment, and operations purposes. So when you're going through and registering consent, you would just need to check this, you just need to select this bubble and able to move forwards and submit the form. We also go over our submission instructions. So this just lists out kind of the next steps that are needed to submit the consent. These are always here for your reference in case, you might forget what needs to be done, just there for anyone to reference as they're going through this process. All right, and then we get into expiration and revocation. So this just goes through the, language that a patient can revoke their consent at any time by just going to a CRISP participating provider and asking them to deactivate their consent, either in person or via a written request. We also go through the expiration date. So this just basically says that, this consent is active until the date that's indicated. And if no date is selected, the consent will not expire and it will remain in effect until it is deactivated. So as you can see here, we have this does not expire section. So this is where you will enter in the expiration date. So as you can see, the form is automatically set to does not expire. However, if patients wish to have a specific date in which their data is no longer shared, you would just be able to toggle this off and then this calendar icon will appear so that you can select the date in which the patient wishes to have their data no longer shared. So you can select a date up to 5 years in advance of when the tool is open. So we could do January 17th of 2030 if they would like. But for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to set to does not expire. We then have identity validation and education attestation. So just verifying that the patient that you wish to register consent for is the patient that you are actually registering consent for. So just doing a double check and making sure that you have searched for the right information. And then secondly, just attesting that you have informed the patient of the consent and answered all of their questions to the best of your ability. And then we have our signature and attestation portion. And so this is where a couple of different actions can occur. So you can so really here is we want to collect the patient's signature. And so we can do this a couple different ways. The first way is electronically. And so that would be where the patient would sign this form here. And once that form is signed, that other option goes away. We also do have the option that you can have a legal guardian, parent, or authorized representative sign the form on behalf of the patient, as well as being able to capture both that legal guardian and the patient's signature if necessary. All right, so if this is an in-person encounter or you're sitting with the patient right there, you're capturing the consent, you would have them electronically sign the form. However, we do have the option to attest for having a consent on file. So this is the testing that you have obtained written and signed consent from the patient, and you'll retain that form for your records. And so I just want to go to the CRISP-DC website to go through that paper consent form. So if you go to the crispdc.org/consent, the first form available on our website is this SUD consent form. And so when you open this form, this is just a paper version of the form that is electronically in our system. And so this just allows patients to fill out, or it allows, whoever is helping the patient complete this form to fill out all this information on paper. This is also a fillable PDF to do electronically. We have all the same options, expiration date field if a patient chooses to have an expiration date, signature, and then legal guardian signature if necessary. And so once this paper form is completed and all the information is filled out, then we require whomever is submitting the form to go back through the consent tool and just fill out all that information as the patient filled out on the paper form. And then you would click this attest to having that paper consent on file, saying that I have that information and that you're retaining that paper form for your records. Another best practice is once this paper form is completed, if you're leveraging this form in your workflows, is just to scan it into your system, put it in your EMR, attach it to the patient's record. So then you have record of that, that consent capture in another place other than this. So that is the plan here. I lost my train of thought, Jamie, so cut that out. So once this information is completed, again, just make sure you keep record of this paper form, upload that somewhere, and put it. Why can I not speak? Upload that and just make sure you keep receipt of that paper copy. And then the last step here is just to enter in the name of the person who's registering consent. So this would be myself, Abby, and then I would go ahead and submit the form. And then you should get a pop-up saying that the consent was successfully submitted. And then you have two options. You can print and exit, or you can exit. And so we're just going to exit today. And then again, it'll just notify you that consent was successfully submitted. So now we're going to go into the consent history. And here you will see all the consents that have been registered for this patient. And so this is our test patient. So this patient has a lot of consents registered. We use this profile a lot. However, when you're looking at a real patient's information, they probably will not have this many consents registered. Maybe they have one from a while ago that's inactive, and maybe a new one is needed to be on file. Or maybe they do have a new one registered recently. But this is a really helpful place to go. And you can also click on the individual records and you can see all the information that was chosen. You can see, the expiration date that was chosen. You can see if the patient signed or revoked, and then who registered that consent. You can also print from here. And so some people also like to print this and save as a PDF. And then you can keep also a copy of that electronic paper form in that patient's EMR record. So then you can just have another place where that information is stored so that everyone at your organization is able to see that and know that this patient already has consent on file. And then you also see here that we have, you can see the expiration date, you can see the status. So you can see some of these are marked as inactive. So, they've been deactivated. And then also these ones are still active. So this is the one that we just did today. And so if, the patient's expiration date right now, it's set to does not expire. Gilbert comes in, a couple months and he says, hey, I don't want my data shared anymore. Can you please deactivate my consent? Really simple. You would just log into CRISP, go to the consent tool, go to consent history, and then you would deactivate consent. And it's just a double click here. It's 2 extra clicks, and then that consent is deactivated. And again, since this is a test patient, this is not the best example, but typically, patients won't have as many consents on file. So, now if this was the only consent that Gilbert had, his data would no longer be flowing through the HIE. So any of that SUD data that we have would no longer be available to be seen by those treatment providers or for the treatment payment and operations purposes. All right, well, that is the CRISP-DC consent tool. If you all ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is abby.lutz@crisphealth.org, and I'd be more than happy to schedule time to walk through this process with you and your team and schedule a one-on-one session.